My name is Ycheng. All right. I am currently serving in NS, right? And I graduated from Hwa Chong Institution 2 years ago, so in 2020. So I'm like 20 this year, right? And with me is Zach. Maybe Zach can do a quick self-introduction.
Yes, my name is Zach. I'm currently also serving NS. I graduated from RI in 2022. 2022 is like TOO, yeah. That's about it.
Yeah, all right, that's great. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be covering a lot of some microeconomics concepts, right? We're not going to go in depth into anything in particular. We're not here to give you a full lecture, right? Just 2 hours is just not enough to cover everything. But what we will be doing is we have dissected and basically drawn out every single concept that we think is extremely important, okay? And basically put them into a set of slides, and we're going to run through them, do a quick revision with you guys. And if there's anything that you're not very sure of and you guys want some clarification on, feel free to send them in the chat later. So we'll be having like a Q&A session at the end, right? So without further ado, I think we can just jump right into it, right? So the scope for today is as such, right? So we have basically three things that we want to cover, right? A quick demand and supply refresher, market failure refresher, and firms and decision refresher. So it looks a bit scarce, but don't worry about it. We have like 90 slides, okay? So we'll keep you entertained for the entire night, right? Just don't worry about it. So I think, without further ado, I think we can just start off with supply and demand. Zach will take us away.
So for supply and demand, right? These are just some of the few things that you'll go through today. Just the general price adjustment process, your determinants of your demand and supply, and lastly, Ycheng will be covering the elasticity concepts. I think some of you were mentioning that you're having a bit of trouble, especially with elasticities when we submitted the Google Forms to you. Okay, so these are very important because basically DDSS is the very basic frameworks that relates to all the other chapters, including your macroecons. So DDSS is very important. So we will be looking at some of the key terms that you go through in demand and supply. So we start off with, I group them as such because some of the things are more important and some of them are not, and some of them you just need to understand but you don't really write it in your essays. So number one, you go through with demand. Some of the schools just write D, some of the schools just write DD. So for myself, I learn DD, demand. And then along with demand, you also learn about law of demand and the law of diminishing marginal utility. The law of diminishing marginal utility is something that schools mostly cover when they are talking about the marginalist principle that you learn at the very start of econs. Okay, and then for supply, I label it SS, and along with that, you also be taught law of supply and the law of diminishing marginal returns. So the law of demand and supply and the law of diminishing marginal utility or returns, these are some things that you need to know at the back of your head, but you don't really actually write it in the essay itself. These are just laws and terms that you need for your own understanding in order for you to write a more well-rounded essay and to know exactly what you are writing about. Okay, so number 3 and number 4, quantity supplied and quantity demanded. I think there was a question in the form that you all responded with someone saying that they get confused between quantity demanded and demand, and quantity supplied and supply. So later you'll go through that and then you'll be able to see the distinction between the two terms. Okay? And then number 5, these are basically all the shorthand writings for the elasticity concepts that we'll be covering today. Number 6, shortage and surplus. These are key terms when you're describing the entire process of the price adjustment in a free market. And lastly, number 7, ceteris paribus. As usual, a lot of people will make fun of this term and make jokes about this term, but at the end of the day, it's a very important term that can determine whether you get that 1 mark or lose that 1 mark in an econs essay. So it's a very important term that you know what it means and you write it down in your essay and all your short answer questions where necessary. Okay? So like I said just now, I think there was one question that asked to clarify the difference between QS, SS, QD, and DD. So quantity supplied and supply, these are two different concepts, and quantity demanded and demand, these are also two different concepts. When you look at a free market diagram, basically the linear graphs that intersect each other, demand and supply refer to the two lines, the two graphs that are plotted on the diagram. And then QD and QS are the axis points that are demarcated on the quantity axis. So demand and supply represent the price that consumers are willing to sell and buy at every value of quantity demanded and quantity supplied. Yeah. So like I said just now, mathematically, this would translate to be the graph of your free market diagram. Then QD and QS are the specific value for the DD and SS graph, respectively, and then it will be demarcated on the x-axis of the graph, which is represented by quantity. So as you can see here, this is where your QS and QD will be demarcated along the axis of quantity, and then demand is the line, the linear graph that points downwards, and supply is the linear graph that points upwards. Okay? So when we talk about free market, we always assume, when we talk about DDSS, we are always assuming that we are in a free market and it's not being affected by external forces. Everything is determined by a rational consumer and a rational producer. Okay? In this case, we will see that market equilibrium is reached when P equals to MC at the point where DD and SS intersect. This is when the cost of producing the next unit of good is equivalent to the benefit of consuming the next unit of good. Therefore, you demarcate, how I like to notate it is that P naught is the equilibrium price and Q naught is the equilibrium quantity. So P naught is where QS equals to QD, where DD and SS intersects. And this will be your equilibrium quantity, and this is your equilibrium price. So I think this should be very familiar. There shouldn't be much confusion about this. This is just your general free market diagram where there isn't any movement in the market yet. So next, we go through the non-price determinants of demand and supply. Okay, when we talk about non-price determinants, it means that these are factors beyond changes in price that will affect the equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price of the market. Okay, so I won't go too deep into what these are. I think they are very self-explanatory. Perhaps one or two I will just give a bit of pointers because they can be quite confusing at times. So over here, when we look at demand, right? You talk about taste and preferences. Basically, are there any changes in how people see the products? Whether they find that Coke recently became a bit sweeter, so they will opt for Pepsi instead. Then that will affect the demand of Pepsi and affect the demand of Coke. Okay? And then next we talk about income. When the consumer's disposable income increases, they are able to purchase a wider variety of items, and hence this will inadvertently result in an increase in demand for most goods and services, because now consumers are more willing and able to purchase all these goods and services. So next we come to the price of related goods, complements and substitutes. So I will just delve a bit into substitutes first. Basically, what a substitute is something like goods that serve the same purpose but are produced by different firms. So how I like to, a very, very good case in example at hand is Coke and Pepsi. So they are both types of colas, but we all know that there's different demand for both drinks because of how people view things. So let's say the company that produces Pepsi faces some issues with their ingredient supplies, and then now the price of Pepsi has increased. So some people who are not so ardent fans of Pepsi might decide that, hey, I'm not gonna pay more for Pepsi. How about I just switch to Coke instead? So this is where you'll see because of the price of Pepsi increasing, the demand for Coke will increase. So this is a substitution effect. Okay. And then next we look at complements. So complements will very easily be confused with derived demand.
Okay, I think I'll just
Sorry.
help you with
I
your
had a
brain
bit of
fart.
a brain fart moment there.
Okay, so essentially, there's a big difference between complementary goods and derived demand groups. Derived demand. So for complement goods, right, the idea is that you're buying both A along with B, right? You're pairing up, or I mean, just look at two items. Let's say you have, from top of my head, a wine glass and a wine bottle, right? Then if you buy a wine bottle, then the complement will be the wine glass, right? Because you want to act posh and pretentious for once in your life. So you're gonna buy that wine glass to drink the wine. So that is complement. For derived demand, the idea is the production line, right? So let's say the demand for sofa increases. Hence, the derived demand for the materials to make that sofa will increase as well, right? So let's say the demand for sofa increases, the demand for certain types of leather will increase, the demand for certain exotic, although unethical sources of materials will also increase as well. So that is my demand, derived demand, where the demand for one good will then lead to a derived demand for another good that contributes to the production of that particular good as well, for the initial good as well. So that is the idea of derived demand. Okay, another idea is, let's say your demand for computers or smartphone increases. The derived demand for smart chips, for processors, for GPUs, all that will also increase, because you need those components to make the laptop or to make that smartphone first. So that's the idea of derived demand versus complements, where derived demand, you're looking at the consumers only obtaining one good, whereas for complements, you're looking at the consumers obtaining more than one good. So it can be 2, can be 3, can be 4, depending on what kind of complements they are. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry, I have a very big brain fart moment there. So sorry about that. Okay, Cal. So moving on, we'll go to seasonal changes. So this is more applicable for markets that particularly contain agricultural products. So for example, the market for corn, let's say that suddenly the producer for corn experiences a big drought, and then the amount of, and then let's say it becomes rainy season, and then suddenly the producer for certain goods and services such as hot soups sees that there's the consumers of these hot soups see that, oh, it'll be nicer to like drink more hot soup on a rainy day, and then this will in turn increase the demand for goods and services that provide hot soup because of the change in season. Yeah, or like let's say it's a very hot season, it's summer, and you really want to eat watermelon because watermelon helps to quench your thirst during the summer. So this will increase the demand for watermelon. And then number 5, we look at price speculation. It's where consumers look at the market and think that perhaps the price of Coke is gonna increase because, let's say, the government imposed a sugar tax. So if the price of Coke increase, if they expect that the price of Coke will increase, they will probably decrease their demand for Coke. That's how price speculation can affect demand. And then next, we look at government policies, taxes, and subsidies. So this will actually be more relevant when we come to market failure later. Government policies, taxes, and subsidies, how it works is that, let's say government imposes a tax on consumers for cigarettes. So in turn, the consumers will have to pay a higher cost for cigarettes, and that will obviously decrease the demand for cigarettes. Or let's say the government gives you more GST vouchers as a form of subsidy to subsidize your groceries. So there will be an increase in demand for daily goods or like dry stores, let's say flour or something. And this will in turn increase the demand for these goods. Next, you look at population/demographics. Obviously, an increase in population means that, let's say, if your family expands, you're gonna need to buy more of a certain product to be able to feed your family, and so this will increase the demand for, let's say, baby diapers, or let's say you're having a baby boom. So your population rises, and along with it, the demand for diapers, milk powder, everything will also increase. Interest and exchange rates, I won't go too in depth because I think that will be more relevant when we cover for macroeconomics. Yeah. Now take a look at supply. The cost of FOPs, for those of you who don't know, FOPs mean factors of production. So let's say you're a producer and you need let's say iron parts to produce a certain machinery. So if there's an increase in the price of iron, because iron is a factor of your production, this will in turn lead to an increase in the this will in turn lead to a decrease in the supply of whatever machinery that the producer is producing, because now your unit cost of production has increased, and so you won't be incentivized to produce as many machinery. Okay, the state of technology will also affect the supply. So let's say I have now implemented automation in my processes. This will improve the efficiency of my production chain. So in that case, my unit cost of production will decrease, and so I'm able to produce more of these, more of whatever I'm producing within a given period of time, as compared to before when I wasn't automated. So this will in turn increase the supply of whatever the producer is producing, because now your supply chain is more efficient. Okay, and then natural factors, similar to seasonal changes, so very relevant for agricultural products. Let's say you're a farmer, you're producing cabbage, but now you're having a drought suddenly, and all of your cabbage is killed off. So your supply of cabbage will drastically decrease. Okay. And then government policies. So let's say in terms of taxes, you have carbon tax on petrochemical firms, where depending on the amount of pollution that you produce, the government will impose taxes on you. And so this will increase your unit cost of production, and you will be less incentivized to produce more petrochemical. And then this, as a result, will reduce the entire supply of the petrochemical that you produce. And then for subsidies, let's say the government provides you with subsidies for R&D. Then if your R&D is successful, you can improve your supply chain processes, and this will in turn allow you to produce more goods. Yeah. Now you look at prices of related goods again. Now you take a look at what is joint supply. So joint supply basically means goods that you have to produce in tandem with each other. So such of these things are like milk and butter. Yeah. So for not just general milk, like skim milk or like buttermilk. So when you try to produce buttermilk, as a result of producing buttermilk, you derive butter from it also. Yeah. So let's say the price of butter increases, then there will be a lower demand for butter, and so and this will affect the price of buttermilk as well, because now you have an excess of you have an excess of buttermilk because of the surplus of butter that you have. Am I phrasing that correctly? Okay. A decrease in quantity supplied of butter will result in more buttermilk, in less buttermilk being offered for sale, because now the producers are less incentivized to produce butter. Correct. And then next you take a look at competitive supply. So competitive supply would mean something like, let's say you use corn. Corn is quite a versatile factor of production. It's a very versatile, it's a versatile factor of production. You can use corn as food, or you can process your corn such that it becomes biofuel. So let's say all of a sudden, the demand for biofuel skyrockets. So this will result in an increase in price of biofuel. And as a result, using corn to produce biofuel will become more profitable for firms rather than using corn as food. So more of the stock of corn will be diverted to making biofuel, and in turn, the supply of corn used for food will decrease. And then lastly, you take a look at a price speculation. So if, let's say, the producers think that the price is going to increase in like the subsequent months, then they may temporarily reduce the amount that they sell in the market, to build up inventory, and only release the amount of the inventory they've stocked up when the prices actually start increasing. This is what price speculation in terms of supply means. Next, so talking, I jabbered on so much about the non-price determinants of demand and supply. I think it's more important that we go into how we can actually write the paragraph for a change in demand or supply. Okay, this is just a general, very general overarching structure of how the demand and supply price mechanism paragraph should be like. Okay, so I will show you all the highlighted parts. So these things that are highlighted are the more important and more juicy bits of the paragraph that the examiner will pay attention to. Okay, so in this diagram, we see that demand has increased in whatever market this is. It can be for, like, let's just say that this is a market for chicken. Okay, so now demand for chicken has increased, probably because of a change in taste and preferences, or like, let's say, the general consumers for pork has fallen because of the increase in price of pork. So people now start to increase demand for chicken because it's an alternative to pork. So now we see that there's an increase in demand, which is shown by the rightward shift of the demand curve from DD0 to DD1. Okay, so now in this case, we assume that supply remains constant. So since supply remains constant, when we look at the diagram, QS equals to the equilibrium quantity because supply hasn't changed at all. And so since Q0 is less than the quantity demanded at the equilibrium price, at the equilibrium price where it's P0, this has resulted in a shortage of, let's say chicken from Q0 to QD. As you can see here, shortage. Yes. This will result in an upward pressure on the prices of chicken because the consumers will now try to outbid each other by offering to pay more money for the chicken, for the limited amount of chicken that is available on the market. Okay, this will cause the price to rise. And then when the prices rise, because firms are profit maximizing, they are incentivized by the prospect of making more money. They will increase the quantity of the chicken supplied, while on the other hand, because of the increase in price, consumers become less willing and able to afford chicken, so they'll decrease the quantity demanded. And then this will continue until a new equilibrium quantity is reached. And that will be where the new price of chicken is. Yeah, until the shortage is eliminated. So at this point here, where I'm pointing to, this is where shortage is 0. And I think this shouldn't be too foreign to most people. Okay, so now we take a look at what will happen if supply were to decrease instead. So when supply decreases instead, obviously price will increase. Here we see that there's a shortage again. And then now there's a shortage of forward to T market. Shortage from Q0 to this quantity over here. So similarly now consumers will try to outbid each other again to buy the chicken. And then now that prices have, and then this exerts an upward pressure on prices again. And since prices rise again, the producers are more incentivized to increase the output of chicken onto the market. So QS will increase. And since the price increases, consumers become less willing and able to afford chicken, and then quantity demanded decreases. Until there's no more shortage, this is where your new equilibrium quantity and new equilibrium price is P1 and Q1. Okay. So this is the case where you have a surplus instead of a shortage when your supply increases. So when there's a surplus, there will be a downward pressure on price. Okay, because now there's too much chicken on the market. So because there's a downward pressure on price, is less profitable for firms to sell more chicken. So they'll decrease the quantity supplied on the market. And then on the other hand, because prices are falling, consumers become more willing and able to buy the chicken. So quantity demanded for the chicken will increase until the surplus is removed. So from P0 and Q0, price of the chicken has fallen to P1 and the equilibrium quantity has increased to Q1. And yeah, so some tips for price mechanism. As you can see, once you figure out the general rule on how to write the paragraph for DD and SS, you can start playing around with the graphs. So most of the time when you're in an exam, there won't be just one shift in demand or one shift in supply. I think most of you will have seen that there will be multiple shifts at the same time. Okay, so it can also be in two different directions. So your supply can decrease or your demand increases. This will give you a very big shortage. Or let's say they can both increase together. Yeah. Yeah, so in the case where either one, in the case where there's any ambiguity in the result of P or Q, you need to take a look at the elasticity of the two curves and also the magnitude of the shifts. So when I say magnitude of the shifts, you need to justify in your essay why DD will shift more than SS and why SS moves more than DD. So let's say the preamble in the essay question gives you some information. I'll just pick some random question from Yeah, okay, let's say you have very poor harvest for certain crops lah. And then also actually no, that's not a good idea. But I think it's easier to understand like that also. Yeah. So you just need to make sure that you just need to be able to make sure that you can justify why the change in magnitude for DD or SS is greater than one or the other lah. Yeah. Then later PD and PES will be covered by Yicheng. Yeah. So this is the general train of thought when you're answering the price mechanism question. Okay. So you need to identify what is shifting. Is it your demand or your supply? Or both, which is very common. In fact, I don't think they will ever ask you for, there will ever be an essay question where it's just one DD or one SS moving. Then next, you need to identify why they are shifting. Is it because of a change in taste and preferences in terms of demand, or is it because of an increase in cost or factors of production for your supply? Okay, so these are you need to brush up on your determinants of DD and SS. Okay, so once you finish shifting both curves already, you need to identify where the new intersection is. Because the new intersection of both curves will be where your new equilibrium quantity and where your new equilibrium price is. And then from there, you'll be able to see the end result. Is it a surplus or a shortage? Yeah. And then where is your QS and where is your QD? So when the purpose of identifying whether it's a shortage or a surplus is to identify whether it's an upward or downward pressure on the price, and hence explain it, and hence your explanation on whether consumers are trying to outbid each other or your producers are going to reduce output because it's less profitable. Okay. And then finally, you identify how big the shift is for each curve. Yeah. And like what I said just now, the PD and the PS of the goods and service. So now I hand over the time to Yicheng to cover elasticities.
Right, thank you so much, Zach. Appreciate that. So now I'm going to cover a little bit more about elasticities, right? A little bit of a mouthful there, but I hope you guys have been following so far, right? So I'm going to be basically just doing a quick refresher on all of the elasticity concepts, right? From price elasticity of demand to, PES, CED, and YED, right? So let's just go right into it, okay? So the first elasticity that we have, right, is actually price elasticity of demand. Next slide, please. Yep. So price elasticity of demand measures the degree of responsiveness of a quantity demanded of a good to a change in its own price. So what does this mean, right? It sounds like a lot of words jumbled together, but really what we're trying to say is that it basically measures how easily a change in a certain price of a good can affect how much of it is demanded. So for instance, right, a very simple analogy will be like this. If let's say today, right, for instance, a bottle of Coke, right, instead of costing $1, it costs you $10. They raise the price from $1 for a bottle of Coke to $10. Now, what do you think the quantity demanded of the Coke will become? Like, what do you think the change will be, right? So because of this change in price from $1 to $10, right, when you increase the price, you will assume that the quantity demanded of the good will actually decrease, right? Fewer people will want to buy this Coke, right? In similar vein, this works for every single good, right, in the entire economy. And this is why we say that actually PED is technically always negative. So PED, the value of it is always negative because price as well as quantity demanded is always inversely related. Nobody want to buy something, nobody want to buy a good that is more expensive than it usually is, right? Like you wouldn't want to buy more of something if it's more expensive than it usually is, right? So it would always be an inverse relationship, and because of that, we normally use, when you're talking about PED, right, price elasticity of demand, we normally use the modular signs beside. You see those lines over there? Those are modular signs to dictate that actually this is a modded value. So it's not actually negative, but when we put the modded signs over, it becomes positive. All right. So this is PED. Now let's go deeply into PED and actually decide and see what exactly we're talking about here, right? So there are two types of PED, right? Either your PED is more than 1 and less than infinity, right? Which basically means there's more than 1, right? This is when the demand of the good is price elastic. It's price elastic, right? So what does this mean? Price elastic means that when you have a change in a good's price, so something becomes more expensive, right? It brings about a more than proportionate change in quantity demanded. Okay, so this is a little bit of a mouthful as well, but what it essentially means is that the quantity demanded changes more drastically than the change in its price. So for instance, I have a pen here, right? Let's say today, right, this pen increases, the price of this pen increases by 2 times, right? So from $1 it becomes $2, right? Because of that, the fall, let's hypothetically, let's say that the fall in the quantity demanded of this pen was actually 4 times, right? So actually, it was a larger fall in quantity demanded than the change in this goods price, right? So just because it increased its price by 2 times, twofold, the quantity demanded dropped by 4-fold. So because of that, we say that this the price of this, right? The demand of this pen is called price elastic, right? Because the change in quantity demanded is much higher than the change in price. All right, so it's more than proportionate. That's how we phrase it, right? So along these slides, you will see a lot of highlighted words. The reason why we highlight these words is for you guys to understand that some of the keywords in economics, right? The keywords are highlighted. So you got to make sure that when you write your essays and when you are actually answering the questions, you have these keywords in your essay. That is to maximize the number of marks that you can get. Okay, so we have price elastic demand. Sorry, previous slide, please. We have price elastic demand on one hand, and we also have price inelastic demand on the other hand, right? Price inelastic demand is actually when PED is less than 0 or less than 1 but more than 0. So it's in between 0 and 1. So what inelastic demand means is that when you have a change in a goods price, it brings about a less than proportionate change in quantity demanded. So when a price of this pen increases by 50%, for instance, right? The demand drop is actually 20%. So when the demand it falls less than the price of it increasing, right? Then you have a price inelastic demand. So this is what we call a less than proportionate change. Okay, so once again, less than proportionate is a keyword that you need to be looking out for here. All right. So it might seem a little bit complex now, but maybe we can see the next slide and basically understand what this actually means diagrammatically, right? So this is how we draw the different graphs, right? So when we're talking about a very elastic demand curve, right? A very elastic demand curve, the gradient of the curve is actually much gentler. So as you can see on the left, right, this is a demand price elastic demand curve, right? So you see that it's actually very gentle, right? And the reason for that is because if you were to move based on the graph, right, and basically just navigate it, you realize that when the price actually drops, right, it results in a very, very large quantity increase, and vice versa, right? When the price increases from the right to left, the quantity demanded decrease is actually much higher, right? It's more than proportionate. So this is what we call price elastic. So the price, right, rather the demand is very, very responsive to changes in price. Very responsive to changes in price. So it goes both ways, right? So on the other hand, we have the other form of curve, right? We have the demand price inelastic curve, right? So when the demand is price inelastic, right, you see that actually the curve is extremely steep, right? The gradient is very high. And if you navigate the graph, you realize that a big change in price only results in a small change in quantity demanded. So when price increases a lot from the right to the left, right, when you go upwards like that, you realize that the quantity demanded decrease actually very, very little. It's less than proportionate. And the same thing goes for the other way around. Okay, so this is how you draw the two different graphs. Just make sure you guys know, especially when you're answering essay questions, right? So sometimes they'll be asking you to analyze different elasticity of demand during your essay answering, and you want to make sure that you are extremely aware of what exactly you're talking about. So you must analyze the good and realize that some goods are actually price inelastic, some goods are actually price elastic, and the determinants for that I'll cover right now. So next slide, please. Oops, sorry. So there is two different other types of graphs for PED, right, that is a little bit more extreme. So when you might be wondering, right? So we have the graph becoming steeper and steeper as the demand becomes more price inelastic. So there's this phenomenon called perfectly price elastic and perfectly price inelastic. So take note that these actually only occur theoretically, because in real life, there's very little chance that actually this kind of curves will happen for any good at all, right? But based on theory, right, you can actually have a completely horizontal line for demand. And what this means is that the price, right, would never change, right? It means that the change in, or rather the change in price, right, will lead to a complete reduction of the of quantity, right? The same goes for price inelastic demand, right? When it's perfectly price inelastic, it is a complete vertical line, right? It's a little bit hard to imagine how this works in real life because, as I said, it's very theoretical, right? You wouldn't find a good in anywhere, right, that is actually price inelastic. But what that means is that actually, if you increase the price indefinitely, the quantity demanded will be exactly the same, right? So no matter what price you set it at, right, the quantity will be exactly the same. So obviously, based on common sense, this will not be possible, in real life, lah. There will not be a single good, right, where you increase the price to like close to infinity, and there will still be people wanting the same amount of people wanting to buy. Okay, the closest example you have to price inelastic, they are perfect price inelastic goods, is actually antiques as well as fine arts, right? So for things like that, right, when it's very limited, the quantity is extremely limited, right, and it's very, very rare, right? So it's likely to say that actually if you increase the price drastically, the quantity demanded will be just the same because you still have the same pool of people demanding these types of very unique goods, okay? But based on your, like, pragmatically speaking, right, based on answering techniques and answering exams, right, you wouldn't need to know all of these graphs. It's just a theoretical example for you guys to sort of see the entire concept clearly from a macro lens, right? Okay, next slide. Right, so here's what I'm talking about when it comes to actually the application of PED in your essays. So if you look at the left, oops, I think I copied the same slide twice, right? So this is actually a graph for price inelastic. So if you take a look at the left graph, right, when you have an increase in price, right, so the price increases from P1 to P2, right, it leads to an increase in total revenue, even though the quantity demanded actually drops. Why is that so? So let's talk about total revenue first. What is total revenue? Total revenue is price multiplied by quantity, right? Price multiplied by quantity. So the first, initially, right, when the price was at P1, okay, when the price was at P1, all right, we have a total revenue of P1 multiplied by Q1. Agree? So it's this rectangle over here, including the green box. Now, when you decrease the price from increase the price from P1 to P2, and it is a price inelastic demand, right? What happens is that your total revenue changes from that to P2 multiplied by Q2. And what you realize is that actually the white space here, right, white space here in between the graph is what's common to these two total revenues, whereas the green space is what was reduced and the red space was what was gained. So just based on the diagrammatic representation, it's very easy to see that actually, oh, the red area is much bigger than the green area. So based on math alone, you can realize that, oh, okay, so for inelastic demand, most producers will want to increase the price. When demand is price inelastic, they want to increase the price. And the reason for that is because they can actually increase the total revenue simply by increasing the price, right? Because demand is price inelastic. All right. So the opposite goes for the price elastic curves. And I think I copied the curve in wrongly. All right. So I'll show you guys later what I mean. But essentially, when the gradient is gentler, right? When the gradient is gentler, the opposite is true. So producers generally want to decrease price when the gradient is gentler. Okay. Next slide, please. Right, so this is what I was mentioning previously, right? So PED, right? How do you determine what kind of good has what kind of PED, right? How do you determine that? So there are generally 4 determinants of price elasticity of demand. Okay, the first one is that the availability of substitutes actually plays a very, very great part. So what do I mean by that, right? Let's say, right, today in this world, right, we only have Coke as a soda, right? Only Coke exists, and people love Coke. Right. So let's say right now, if I increase the price of Coke from $1 per can to $2 per can, and you don't have any substitutes at all, so you have no other forms of soft drinks available, you're more likely to be able to want to demand it more, right? Correct? Because that's the only thing available. There are no substitutes available. However, if let's say you have a slew of sodas available for you, you have Pepsi, you have Dr. Pepper, you have all these types of sodas, right? Just because I increase the price of Coca-Cola from $1 to $2 doesn't mean that you will be depleted of all your beverage choices, right? So what that means is that you can actually find a different substitute. Okay, you can buy some, you can turn to Pepsi Cola, you can turn to Dr. Pepper, Fanta, whatever, right? And because of that, it's likely that your demand in this case will be very price elastic, right? You won't really increase the quantity demanded, and your quantity demanded will actually decrease drastically due to this price increase. So that's the first determinant of PED, right? Now the second one is proportion of income. So imagine it this way, right? If let's say today you're going to the supermarket, right? And then you're just like happily going about, and your mom asks you, hey, can you get me some salt from the supermarket? Now you don't know how much salt costs, right? But you see the price has increased from $1 per packet to $2 per packet. Now, is that something that's going to bring about a very large change in whether or not you buy this salt? Not likely, right? Even though it's a 2 times increase. Because after all, it's still only $2, right? It still takes up maybe like a small proportion of your income. However, if now the question changes and now your mom asks you to go out and buy her a car, right? Buy her an actual like Toyota, for instance. Now, the Toyota used to cost $100,000, but now it multiplied by 2 and changes into $200,000, right? Now, would that idea change, right? Would you be more willing or less willing to buy the Toyota? Obviously you'll be less willing, right? You'll be a bit more apprehensive because it takes up such a large proportion of your income, right? So that twofold change actually makes a big difference now, even though it's still the same percentage change, right? So in that vein, the proportion of income actually plays a very large role in determining what the PED is for a certain good. Okay, now the next question is the next factor is degree of necessity. What does this mean, right? Some people don't quite understand this, but let me give you an analogy. So for instance, right now you are super hungry, right? You are in a war-torn country, right? You're super hungry, and there are 2 things you can purchase. You have $50, for instance. There are 2 things you can purchase, right? So you can first purchase perhaps a gold bar, right? A very massive gold bar, right? Which is at 50% discount. It used to cost $100, right? The next thing you can purchase is simply a loaf of bread, right? Which used to be $5, but now because you're in a war-torn country, right, it's now at $50. So it increased by 10 times the price. So with this $50, what do you think is more valuable to you? What would you more likely buy? Would you more likely buy the discounted gold bar, or would you more likely buy the loaf of bread because you are really very hungry, you need to feed your family, right? So in that vein, in that sort of like mindset, you realize that actually the way people make decisions, right, based on behavioral economics, the way we make decisions is largely revolving around what? Largely revolves around the necessity that you have, right? So if I need that bread right now for me to survive, obviously I don't mind paying $50 for it, even though it's at a 10 times markup, right? Even though the gold is at a steal, right? And I'll buy it normally if I don't need the food, but now I need the food very desperately. I need to feed my family, so I will buy that even though it's more expensive. So in that thought process, it really illustrates the idea of necessity and how it sort of skews our perception, right, of demand, our perception of what goods we want to purchase. Now, the last thing is time period, and you'll be seeing this factor in almost every single PED or every single elasticity concept, right? So here's how it works. I'm only going to explain it once, okay? But essentially how time period works is that at a different time period, so for instance, in a time period of one day, right, versus 1 year, the elasticity of a good will actually change drastically, right? Because of the factors we have mentioned previously, right? In a period of 1 year, everything can change, right? Proportion of income can change, degree of necessity can change, availability of substitutes can also change. You can have more substitutes available or less or fewer. So generally, when time period becomes larger, right, you would generally see that actually your demand becomes more price elastic because you have more choices, right? You have more options, and a lot of things can change within a longer time period. However, when the time period is short, like 1 day, you realize that actually, wow, the demand is much more price inelastic because we are only talking about a singular period of time that is very, very short. Okay, so this is true for almost every single elasticity concept. When the time period increases, right? When the time period increases, okay, you realize that actually the demand or the elasticity becomes more elastic generally. Okay. Next. Right, so the next concept that we'll talk about is income elasticity of demand. Give me a second, let me take this off. It's a little bit warm in here. All right, so income elasticity of demand it goes like this, right? So it's similar to your price elasticity, but now we're talking about how income actually changes the quantity demanded of a good. How your income actually changes the quantity demanded of a good, right? So this is the formula here, right? YED, why I don't know why they use like the letter Y. I think it's because I looks too much like 1, but basically the acronym here is YED, right? YED equals to percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in income. Okay, so what does that mean that exactly, right? Next slide. So there are next slide. Okay, so there are 3 different types of YED values, right? 3 different types. So YED can be negative, can be positive, and the reason for that is because there is actually a relationship where YED is negative, and I'll explain that a little bit more later. But essentially, there are 3 different signs and magnitudes of YED. The first one is when the good is income price elastic. What does that mean? So these goods are what we call necessities, right? So when YED is less than 1 or more than 0, right, in between 0 and 1 basically, right, this means that a change in income will lead to a less than proportionate change in quantity demanded of a certain good. So let's say my income used to be $5,000 a month. Now it increases by 2 times, right? So now it's $10,000 a month, right? With this increase in income, right, if let's say my consumption of pens, right, pens, for instance, right, increases by only 50% instead of 100%. This is what I call income price elastic good, right? Income price elastic. So what that means is that actually my increase in income doesn't really lead to a very massive increase in the quantity demanded of this good. So this is usually true for necessities. So things like bread, things like for instance like food, right, water, right, you wouldn't really increase your consumption of this good very proportionately to your increase in income, right? Just because you increase increase your income by like 2 times doesn't mean that you will increase the amount of rice you consume, for instance, right, or the number of water you actually consume. So these types of goods, necessities, are what we call income price inelastic goods, right? So on the other hand, we have income price. Oh, I think I wrote it wrongly. My bad. So it should be other way around. Income price inelastic should be necessities, whereas income price elastic should be luxury goods instead, right? So for the other hand, when we talk about luxury goods, right? So income price elastic goods, right? We have YED that's more than 1. Right, so that means that a change in income actually leads to a more than proportionate change in quantity demanded. So these are goods such as like your LV bags, your Gucci shoes, for instance, right? Your gold chains, right? Your diamonds, stuff like that. So things that are not exactly necessary for survival, not needed on a daily basis, but are things that are luxurious, right? So for goods like that, when your income actually increases, right, you see a more than proportionate change or more than proportionate increase in the quantity demanded of this good. And it goes vice versa, right? If your income suddenly decreases, you realize that you actually cut down on these luxury goods first, correct? All right, so that's for the second type. Now, the third type is a little bit more less counterintuitive, actually, less intuitive, right? So it's when your income elasticity is negative. So this is what we call inferior goods, right? So goods that are that will not be consumed if you have enough income. Okay, so YED is less than 0, right? When YED is less than 0, there's an inverse relationship between your income as well as the quantity demanded. So an increase in income actually brings about a decrease in quantity demanded for this good, and vice versa, right? So when income decreases, you actually consume more of these sort of inferior goods. So you might be asking, why would that happen, right? When income increases, why would you decrease the consumption of a certain good, right? And the reason for that is because you are substituting this good for something that's a little bit better. So normal goods, right, are substituted for inferior goods. So for instance, right, let's say right now you only earn $500 a month and you need to feed all of your family members, right? So if you don't have enough income, what would you do when you want to pay for food, pay for bills? Would you go and dine in at like Din Tai Fung and all those like very, very expensive restaurants? The answer is probably no, right? You probably wouldn't. Now, if you increase, you'll probably eat like at like hawker centers and stuff like that, right? You find the cheapest meal possible, and even if it means eating just plain rice every day, you'll do that, right? So that's what we call inferior goods, in the sense that because of out of necessity, you'll eat at or you'll purchase or consume these goods because they allow for your survival and they are within your spending means. Now, if that $500 a month now increases to $50,000 a month, do you think you will still be consuming the same amount of hawker center food and still be consuming the same amount of like white rice and white bread, stuff like that, just to sustain yourself? The chances are no, right? You probably wouldn't, because now you have the means to consume better items, and we all seek increase utility as consumers. You want to increase your welfare, you want to increase your utility, right? So because you strive for that, when your income increases, you will decrease your consumption of such inferior goods. So this is what we call negative income elasticity. Okay, negative income elasticity. We'll basically replace inferior goods with normal goods, which are necessities or like luxury goods, right? When our income increases. All right. So that's basically YED in a nutshell. Next. Now, what determines the different levels of YED, right? How you determine income elasticity. Now, the first one is the nature of the good, right? So if the good is something that is, as I mentioned before, is an inferior good, a normal good, or a luxury good, right? So when that happens, it really affects your YED, right? It affects how your income actually affects the quantity demanded. The second thing is your level of influence or level of affluence, affluence or income, right? So for instance, right, let me just give you an example. Do you guys maybe like a Coach? You know what Coach is, right? It's like the brand. A Coach bag might seem like something that's very, very luxurious, very expensive, right? But to someone who's earning like $100,000 a month, do you think that will be still a luxury good? They'll probably go up higher and higher, right? They'll probably buy like diamond filled bags or like Hermes or whatever, right? All those much more luxurious brands, right, than Coach. But to regular human beings like myself and yourself, right, with low levels of income, right, we actually find all of these bags, these expensive bags, anything more than $50, right, is actually really expensive, really. Correct? So in that idea, right, if you toss around the idea, actually, the more affluent you become or the higher your income, it affects your perception of goods and where they fall in. So luxury goods to us might not be the same as luxury goods to millionaires and billionaires, right? So that's what I mean by level of income and affluence affecting income elasticity of demand. Okay, next slide. All right, so this is how we draw it diagrammatically, right? How do we show this graph? You won't basically be asked to draw something like that, but this is just to show you in a sense, right? Exactly how these graphs look like. Okay, so as income increases, right, the consumption of the demand curves of these actually fall in place like that. So the inferior goods, right, the demand curve for inferior goods actually lie towards the left, whereas necessities lie towards the right, and luxury goods all the way towards the right. All right, so that's just a diagrammatic way to show it. You won't be so like pragmatically speaking, right, you wouldn't need to be able to draw this graph during your exams itself, right? There won't be any case where this will be useful for you, right? So just remember that graphs are supposed to help your examiner understand your words. Okay, so they should be supplementing what you're saying. You don't have to memorize every sort of graph when you're writing your essays, all right? So yeah, just for your information, this is how it should look like if you were to draw a different YED curve and show it in terms of demand shifting. Okay, next. Yeah, so now cross elasticity of demand is something that is a little bit related to what Zach was mentioning just now. So he was talking about complements and substitutes when he's referring to demands and the determinants of it, right? So what cross elasticity of demand goes to show is it tries to measure the responsiveness of quantity demanded of a good to a change in price of another good. So it sounds a bit confusing, like how can a price of another good affect a quantity demanded for a separate good? Right, so let me explain it a little bit. Right, so the acronym for this is CED or XED, depending on what school you're from, but honestly, it doesn't matter too much. Okay, so let me explain it real quick, right? For instance, right, let's say your okay, this example is, okay, let's say you have a phone, right? I have a phone here, right? So my phone is Apple, right? So let's say today this phone, right? This phone decreases, the price of this phone decreases. So it's from $1,000, it becomes $200, right? Because of that, obviously based on PED, right? The quantity demanded of iPhone will increase because now it's so cheap, right? It's like 20% the original price. Agree? So that's a direct change due to this change in price, right? Now, what other things happen because of this? So what is needed for this iPhone to work? Chargers, right? Or in other words, maybe portable chargers, right? So if let's say the price of this decreases, portable chargers that have the compatible port to iPhone, for instance, the price of this, or rather the quantity demand of this, will actually be affected as well, because this is what we call a complement. So these two are complements because this power bank over here allows me to satisfy this want. Right, so together they satisfy the same one, which is people wanting to stay connected with friends, people wanting to basically work on the go. So these mobile devices allow that to happen. And for me to use this properly, I need to have a charger. So these are called complements, right? So because this demand increases, as a result, my complement's demand also increases. And that's what we call cross elasticity of demand. One good's price change affects the quantity demanded for another good. Okay, now let's think of it in another way. Let's say, right, today I have iPhone, and iPhone price decreased once again to 20% of its original price. Now, let's say this is another brand of phone, right? Let's say this is Samsung, for instance, okay? So what do you think the price and the quantity demanded of Samsung will change? How do you think it will change? So if let's say this iPhone now costs $20, for instance, right? Instead of $1,000. Do you think that the people will still want to buy Samsung if it doesn't change its price at all? So Samsung still costs $1,000, but this costs $20. Now, do you think people will switch to iPhone? Chances are they would, right? Because these two are what? These two are substitutes, right? So Samsung, iPhone, they satisfy the same want, right? They satisfy the same want, and because of that, right, a change in the price of this iPhone will affect the, will affect the quantity demanded of Samsung. Okay, so let's take a look at what this means in terms of sign and magnitude, right? Next slide, please. Okay, so a positive cross elasticity, right, represents that it's a substitute. So anything that's above zero, if CED or XCD is above zero, right, we're talking about substitutes here. Why is that so? So if the demand for substitutes change in the same direction, right, we have a substitute relationship. What does that mean? So price of iPhone now increases, okay, then the demand for Samsung, because it's a substitute, will also increase. So they move in the same direction, right? And because of that, CED is positive, and thus it is a substitute relationship, right? So in other words, right, layman terms, right, when something becomes more expensive, consumers want to consume more of the substitutes. If tea, for instance, right, drinking tea becomes very, very expensive, you will probably switch to something else like coffee, for instance, right? Something that substitutes tea and satisfies the same want. Now, on the other hand, when the cross elasticity is actually negative, right, and CED is less than zero, okay, a change in the goods price will cause the demand for its complements to change in the opposite direction. So just now the analogy, right, same thing, okay, if my phone becomes super cheap, right, price drops, demand for this increases, so it goes in opposite directions, right? In a similar vein, if now my phone becomes super expensive, right, this power bank over here, which helps me satisfy the same one jointly, right, if this demand increases a lot, right, this price increases a lot, the demand for my complements, right, will actually decrease. So it always moves in opposite directions when it is a complement. Okay, so in layman terms, when something becomes cheaper, goods that are consumed along with it are demanded more, okay, and vice versa. Next slide, please. Okay, so now this is like another like a graph showing how CED and shift in demand works, right? So when the increase in price of goods A occurs, right? So let's say the demand curve so the price of goods A actually increases, there will be a decrease in demand for good A, and also for its complements, right, will actually decrease, whereas the substitutes will increase. Okay, so this is how you show the change in all these demand curves. Once again, not something that is very, very common in terms of being asked for it in exams, so you don't have to really worry about this curve. As long as you understand how it works diagrammatically, that should suffice, okay? So just take note of that, right? Don't need to be too worried if you've never seen this before. Next slide, please. Now, the last concept of elasticity is PES, right? So as you can see, before this, every single thing is revolving around demand, right? PED, right? YED and CED. Now, the last concept is actually about supply, and it's similar to the first concept, right? Basically, for PES, what we're measuring is the responsiveness of quantity supplied, okay, now it's supplied, of a good to the change in its price. So for instance, right, if I increase the price of this good, increase the price of the phone, how fast and how much will this quantity of this phone being supplied increase? How much will it increase, right? So this is what we're measuring. So it's the opposite of PED in the sense that we're now talking about how fast and how responsive quantity supplied is. Okay, next slide, please. Now, so there are two different classifications of PES, right? There's a price inelastic supply and price elastic supply. So when it's inelastic, right, PES is less than 1 and more than 0, so in between 0 and 1. And what that means is that actually a change in the goods price will cause a less than proportionate increase in quantity supply. Less than proportionate increase, right? So let's say I don't know, I'm running out of items from on my table to talk about. Let's say this book, okay, this book, the price of it increases to from $1 to $10. Now, the suppliers will definitely be like, wow, that's great. Let me supply more of it because I've obviously, because of the price increase, I want to earn more money lah. So if let's say because of this price increase from $1 to $10 by 10 times, right, my quantity supply increases only 5 times. So it's less than proportional, right? This is what we call an inelastic supply, a price inelastic supply. And the same goes for the other way around for price elastic supply. Means that the quantity supply will actually increase more than proportionally to an initial change in a goods price. Okay? So once again, that relationship between elasticity and inelasticity is illustrated here. All right, next slide, please. Now, the determinants of PES is a little bit more unique. So once again, you have the time period, the third point over here, same as PED, so I'm not going to cover it, right? But for the first two, it's a little bit more complex, right? So the first one is existence of spare capacity. So what does that mean, right? Spare capacity refers to the ability for producers or suppliers to increase the production of something due to the availability of resources. So resources are, to recap, we have 4 resources, right? Just to give you a quick refresher, I know we're not talking about it today, but there are 4 types of resources, right? We have land, we have labor, we have capital, and we have entrepreneurship, right? So as long as you have spare resources in each of these fields, you are able to increase production very quickly and thus, be very responsive to a price increase. Okay, so existence of spare capacity allows for producers to increase their quantity supply very quickly and be very responsive to an initial change in price. Now, the second factor or second determinant of PES is actually this, right? The nature of production. So if your production, right, if let's say there's a lot of factor mobility, meaning that let's say I'm a factory, right, and I produce different electronics, right, and now suddenly my price of my phone increases a lot. So am I able to substitute some of these factory plants that are currently producing other electronics and change it into something that can produce phones? That's called factor mobility, right? The ability to basically substitute different factors of production and move one from the other, right? So in that sense, if I'm able to do that, very quickly, right, then I can basically increase and respond to this price increase very quickly, right? I can respond fast, and thus my PES will likely be very elastic. Okay, the next idea is length of production period. So if let's say right now I'm saying the phone production of a phone actually takes 2 months to produce. And today, suddenly the price of this phone increases by 10-fold. The earliest I can actually increase this price, or rather increase the supply of this phone, is 2 months. Because if I start producing today, I can only finish production in 2 months. So if let's say the length of production is very, very long, you can expect that actually the responsiveness, the degree of responsiveness, and also the PES will be very inelastic. Because as a producer, I'm unable to increase the prices as quickly as I should. I need to wait for the production period to end. Right? The same goes for ease of accumulating inventory and stocks, right? So if let's say my production period is very long, but before this price increase, I already prepared as a smart producer. I prepared already, right? And I basically stocked up my warehouse full of iPhones, but I kept it away from the public. I didn't sell it first. So this is what we call spare stock and capacity and inventory, right? So if I have accumulated these and I can accumulate it easily, because I mean iPhone's easy to store, right? Just stack them up, right? Then I can very easily basically increase and respond to this change in price. However, if let's say, right, I'm not a phone producer, right? I'm a fishmonger, for instance, okay? So today, my fish prices increases from $10 to $50 because suddenly people like sashimi, for instance, right? So if you think about it, fish is okay, right? Because you have a short length of production in a sense. I can just go out and start fishing, but I'm unable to accumulate inventory because what happens when you keep a fish, kept away in the warehouse for too long? It gets spoiled, right? It becomes bad, right? You grow mold and become bad. You can't eat it anymore. So things like livestock, things like meat, poultry, food-related items, right? It's normally not as easy to accumulate stocks, which is why the PES might be more inelastic. Okay, right? So that's basically all from me. All right, I'm gonna pass the time now. Oh, okay, sorry. One more slide. My bad. All right. So for this last slide is basically illustrating how the different PES curves look like. So this is actually quite important, right? For elastic curves, similar to your demand elastic curves, is actually extremely gentle, right? Very, very gentle, right? And for inelastic supply curves, it's actually very steep. So this is exactly the same as your demand PED curves, right? So just remember this, as long as you don't forget anything, right? Just remember that as long as we're talking about inelastic, right? The more inelastic it is, the closer to a vertical line it becomes. Whereas the more elastic it is, the closer to a horizontal line it becomes. Okay, next slide. All right, so now I'm going to pass the time back to Zach to talk to you about market failure, which is the second topic of tonight.
Alright guys, so now we'll be continuing on with the crash course for market failure. So over here we have the definition of market failure that I wrote down at the bottom. So as you see, it's the failure of the free market to achieve efficient allocation to maximize society's welfare and achieve social goals. So I think subsequently each one will be going through all the various forms of efficiency in for firms and in the market in general. But for market failure, generally we are just talking about two types of efficiency. More importantly, allocative efficiency, and then in some contexts we'll be talking about productive efficiency now. So for market failure, what we're doing usually is to compare a failing market to a perfectly competitive market. So a perfectly competitive free market is, as I showed you in the very first diagram, where DD equals to SS. And then now the focus that we have for market failure is to achieve, as I said just now, productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. So allocative efficiency is achieved when P equals to MC, where the price of the good is equivalent to the marginal cost of producing that good, or in this case, the opportunity cost in terms of resources used to produce the last unit of good. Also, it will also be demarcated, notarized as when marginal social benefit is equivalent to the marginal social cost at the allocatively efficient level of production. Okay? So in your essays for market failure, what the examiner wants, what we need to do is to show the examiner you know why market failure occurs and explain how the different sources of market failure leads to market failure. So I think it shouldn't be too foreign to you guys. Most of you will probably hear of the term a divergence between your marginal social cost and your marginal social benefit, or your marginal social benefit with the marginal private cost or the marginal private benefits. It's also market failure also occurs in certain cases where it's denoted as P more than MC, which means that the price of the good is greater than the marginal cost of producing that good. Okay, so now, like what I showed you just now, this is basically how a free market diagram in a market with zero market failure looks like, where your equilibrium quantity is equivalent to the socially optimal quantity of goods produced. So you might be thinking, why does the market fail? And over here we've listed down a few ways that the market can fail. Okay, so number one, externalities. In very layman terms, this means selfishness. Okay, when you consume or produce a certain good, you incur costs to other people, third-party costs they call it. Okay, and that can be done in two ways lah. We will delve more into talk about a little bit more about that later. Number two, you have imperfect information. Basically, the consumers are stupid. Okay, they don't know that they overestimate or underestimate the benefits or the cost of consuming certain products. And then number three is basically merit and demerit goods is basically a combination of reasons, which can be externalities, imperfect information, and subsequently we'll be also talking about excessive income inequality. Number four, we talk about public goods, whereby you have goods that are necessities that should be produced that will bring value to society, but unfortunately, because of certain circumstances, producers are not incentivized to produce these goods, and so there's a missing market for these goods and how we can overcome them. So number five, market dominance, will be covered more by Yicheng later when we talk about firms and decisions. And number six, we will talk about information failure, basically the two big ones, asymmetric information and moral hazards. Number seven, you talk about factor immobility and how the movement of factors of production may affect and eventually result in market failure. Okay, so first we will talk about externalities. So for externalities in itself, we have 4 different types. Negative externalities of production, such as pollution. Negative externalities of consumption, such as secondhand smoke. Number 3, positive production externalities, such as R&D. And number 4, positive consumption externalities that you can, for example, education that might result in higher, more well-trained workers that will improve the efficiency of your firms and hence lower the price and yada yada yada. Okay, so usually most of the time when we talk about market failure, as you can see over here, these terms come out very often. Okay, some schools, they would like to put for demand MPB plus MEB, but for me it's a preference thing. You can put it as minus MEC or plus MEB. Okay, it's just to denote that there might be a benefit from consuming certain products or like producing certain products. Okay, so because MEC cost is already negative, you put a minus in front such that to denote that the benefit is actually more than there are actually third-party benefits to consuming certain goods. Okay, so here we see in a free market in general, in a perfectly competitive free market with zero market failure, your supply will be equivalent to your marginal social cost and the marginal private cost, where MEC equals to 0. So that there are no third-party costs, no externalities whatsoever. That will be a market where there's no market failure. Okay. Unfortunately, in this case, we are talking about when a market fails. So MEC will be more than 0. Okay. So what are externalities? Externalities are basically third-party costs or benefits arising from production or consumption of goods and services by individuals and firms. Hence, because of externalities, your marginal external cost will be more than 0. And this will lead to a divergence between your marginal private benefit or marginal private cost and the marginal social benefit and your marginal social cost. Okay? And then this is a general diagram that you use for market failure. Okay? I think most of you should be able to recognize that this triangle that's shaded in the center here will represent the deadweight loss. Okay, we'll talk more about that later. So a common misconception when we talk about externalities is where people mix up externalities and external costs or benefits. Okay, so for example, in the 4 examples that I brought up just now, second-hand smoke will be the externality. The external costs and benefits due to the second-hand smoke will be the additional healthcare costs that the government might have to cover for people affected by second-hand smoke, such as the increased incidence of cancer and other lung-related illnesses. Okay, and then when we talk about pollution, for example, in the production of, as a negative externality in the production of petrochemicals, you talk about higher environmental conservation costs that the government has to bear. This will be the external cost of the pollution. Okay, also when we talk about R&D as a positive externality of production, you talk about how R&D can lead to improved efficiency to lower production costs across the industry due to information sharing. Okay, and then in turn, due to the improved efficiency, your unit cost of production for all these firms will be lowered and in turn translate to lower costs for consumers. And then lastly, you talk about education. Better education, when you consume education, there are positive externalities in the sense that the workers that you produce now will be better educated and hence they'll be better trained, and this will improve the efficiency of workers in the future because the quality of the workers that you produce is now higher, and this will hence lower the production cost for firms and in turn translate to lower unit cost of production, which is good. Okay, so when writing an a paragraph for externalities in explaining why market failure occurs due to externalities. These are some of the points that you need to take note of that should be included inside your paragraph. Okay. So number one, you need to talk about what kind of externalities are there. Is it externality cost of production or consumption? Is it positive or negative? And then next, you need to explain and provide examples of the external cost and what the externality is. Number three, you need to tell the examiner that there's a divergence between your MPB/MPC and the marginal and the MSB/MSC. The divergence is as I've shown you in this one. So over here, the gap between your MSC and your MPC, this will be where your MEC is. This is where the marginal external cost lies. All right. So the divergence, basically, you're talking about how your MSC is now more than your MPC. Okay. So next, you have to mention that society will then bear the benefit or cost from these externalities. And because now the social cost of benefit is now higher or lower than the private cost of benefit. And under free market forces, where your equilibrium quantity is at MPC equals to MPB, while your socially ideal output is at QS, as is shown here, you will now see that there's an under or overproduction by QEQS. So this is the quantity that's being overproduced or underproduced. Okay? And at the same time, you'll be able to see the deadweight loss as I've shown you, represented by, usually we'll write ABC. That's what I like to do. Fortunately, I couldn't add the letters in today. Okay? And then the last sentence is quite important as a wrap up on your paragraph explaining the externalities and how market failure is caused. Okay, so you need to mention that because of this deadweight loss and the under allocation or over allocation of scarce resources, there's now a loss of social welfare due to the misallocation of scarce resources, which has resulted in market failure. Now, the importance of this sentence is because, like I said at the very start of this, allocative efficiency is the main form of efficiency that we want to achieve in market failure. So this basically just shows the examiner that, hey, I know what I'm talking about. I know that allocative efficiency is being compromised, and that's why there's market failure. And then in between all this big chunk of information is to show the examiner how allocative inefficiency has occurred. Okay. So next we talk about merit and demerit goods. Okay. So these are basically goods that are deemed by the government as socially desirable or undesirable, depending on whether it's a merit or demerit good. Okay. And because of this, and because of how the government sees it, the goods may be over or under consumed. And they can be merit or demerit goods based on several factors. Okay, it can be because of the consumer's ignorance, so he overestimates or underestimates the benefits or costs of consuming that good, which is what I've mentioned at the start as imperfect information. Or it can be externalities of consumption, where the consumer consumes the good and doesn't care about the third-party cost that is being borne by others from consuming that good. Okay, and then lastly, also, as I said, excessive income inequality. Okay, so we'll go into, like, this is what I just said just now. Now we'll go into imperfect information. Okay, so this is a general graph of for a market with imperfection and how you would draw the market failure diagram for imperfect information. Over here, you see the MPB with imperfect information, and over here you see the MSB equals to InPB, where when there's no imperfect information. That means the marginal social benefit will be equivalent to the marginal private benefit, because now the consumers are completely aware of all the costs and benefit that is being borne by them from consuming the good. Okay? Give me one moment, 5 seconds, real quick. I need to answer the dog for a while. Okay, so continuing on, so this is just a very general outline of imperfect information. Okay, imperfect information is basically caused due to consumers' over or underestimation of the private costs and benefits from consuming certain goods and services. Okay, more prominent forms of merit goods or demerit goods are such as cigarettes, education, vaccination, and so on and so forth. Okay, this will then result in the consumers over or under consuming the good or service. Okay, and then under free market conditions, where the equilibrium output is at QE, which is what I denote as equilibrium quantity, is where your MPC equals to your MPB with imperfect information. Whereas your socially output level is at OQS, where MPC equals to MPB without imperfect information. Okay. So now, due to overconsumption or underconsumption of the good by QEQS, as seen here, there's over or under allocation of scarce resources, and this causes a deadweight loss, denoted by this squiggly area here. Okay. As a result, this will lead to loss of social welfare due to misallocation of scarce resources. Okay. And then I think you can see there's a very general trend over here. The similarities between the points that I've written here and the points that I wrote for externalities. And this is a very general structure of how I personally write my market failure paragraphs. And so for income inequality, there's also a graph, and most of the graphs will be very similar to what I've drawn here. Okay. So market failure occurs due to the inability of the consumers to afford a good or service due to income inequality. So when you have a very big majority of people that are generally considered poor, but a very small minority of people that are very rich, there's a possibility where the majority of people with a low income proportion are able to afford merit goods such as vaccination and education. And then this will give rise to what we call inequity, which I will cover a bit later on, right? So now, due to the inability of these consumers to afford the merit good or service, the market demand for these goods and services will be lower than socially desirable, because they are unable and unwilling to pay for the goods and services, despite the desirability of these goods and services. And as such, underconsumption of these goods occurs. And this results in under-allocation of the scarce resources towards producing these services. So a very prominent case at hand is education. And basically, if you are too poor to be able to afford education, you're unable to pay and you're unwilling to pay for education, even though education is deemed by the government to be very good for your child, helping your child attain a better future. Economically, it is good also because it improves and increases the pool of workers in the economy and produces higher quality of workers. You don't want to consume it. So this will lead to underconsumption. So as I said previously, this will produce a deadweight loss as seen in the diagrams that I've shown you guys just now. And this leads to a loss in social welfare and hence market failure occurs. Okay. Next, we talk about inequity, as I said just now, because due to income inequality, not everyone is able to afford essential items such as education and healthcare. Then, equity basically refers to a distribution of the income that is considered to be fair and just. Is not equal distribution of income, because it wouldn't be fair if I were to bear more risk than you as a boss and earn the same amount of money as you as a worker. Because at the end of the day, if anything happens to my company, I will be the one that goes bankrupt, while my workers will not go bankrupt because they are still able to find jobs elsewhere. Okay? When we talk about equitable distribution, there are many arguments to it on what is deemed as equitable distribution, but a very general rule of thumb is that everyone should be able to have access to essential goods and services such as education and healthcare, and not excluded because of income differences. Okay, so this is just a very general overview of what inequity is. So next, we move on to public goods, and I think this has actually come up quite often in some of the A-level papers. So what public goods are goods that are non-rivalrous and non-excludable. Okay? An example of explanation of what non-rivalry is basically when I consume a unit of this good, I will not diminish the quantity of the good for other consumers. And because of that, the marginal cost of producing this good will be zero. And as we've said just now, allocative efficiency is achieved when P equals to MC. So if MC equals to 0, P equals to 0, and your producers virtually earn nothing from producing this good or service. So because firms are profit incentivized, no firm is going to be incentivized to produce these goods, and no consumer will pay for the good if it's more than $0, because the marginal cost of producing that good is $0. But at the same time, there's a necessity for this good or service because it's beneficial for society. But due to the non-rivalrous nature of the good, there's now a missing market for that good, which is basically total market failure. And another characteristic of public goods are that they are non-excludable. So what we mean by non-excludable is that it's impossible or very costly to exclude people who don't pay for the good from consuming that good. Such things, an example will be like military protection. Okay, you can't have a group of people that pay for military protection even though everyone else benefits from the guy paying for military protection. Okay, and then because non-payers cannot be excluded from military protection, they are not incentivized to pay, because why would I pay for something where I won't need to move a finger and I will still be covered under? Okay, and then this basically results in a free rider problem. I'm sure many of you have heard this term before. Also, because of this, it will be almost impossible or very difficult for these producers to collect revenue from the consumers of the non-excludable product. And then when there are so many people who are just freeloading off this good or service, no one will be incentivized to even produce this, because they are basically making a loss. So there's no point in producing this for a group of freeloaders. And then eventually it will be the same as a non-rivalrous product. It will result in a missing market despite the necessity for the service. Okay, and then this will be total market failure, which is very bad. Okay. So next, market dominance will be covered by Ycheng later under firms and decisions, and he will also explain to you how market dominance will result in market failure. Okay. So now we move on to information failure. Okay, we have asymmetric information basically. So there are two forms of asymmetric information: adverse selection and moral hazard. Okay, adverse selection happens when the consumer or the producer has better information. Okay, so in the case of producers having better information, such as in the used car industry, okay, the producer knows that these cars don't work particularly well, or at least it's a lower grade than normal regular cars, okay. Obviously, you have used car sellers that sell you very good cars and they charge you the appropriate pricing, okay. But then because of these people who, these producers of used cars that like to charge people higher price for a car that is defective, consumers will start to lowball all these proper sellers due to the risk of buying defective goods. And then because of the lowballing, all these sellers of the higher quality goods will become discouraged, and they will in turn cut down the supply of these higher quality goods. So this will open up the market for what we call lemons, basically low quality goods, and then the market for gems, which are higher quality goods, will start to dissipate. That means it will start to disappear. Okay, so like what I said just now, this is relevant in the markets for used cars and insurance. Okay, in the context of insurance is where the consumer has more knowledge than the insurance agent with regards to his health. So let's say you are a smoker that smokes like 1 pack a day for the next 5 years. Obviously, the incidence of you getting lung cancer is much higher. And when you're buying insurance, they take into account the risk of you getting lung cancer and the risk of you developing any chronic diseases as a result of your smoking habit. And in turn, because of that, the insurance agency will be bearing a higher risk in accepting you as in covering your health insurance. And that's why they will charge you higher premiums. But let's say you withhold that information from them, they will charge you a lower premium. But at the same time, when you actually get lung cancer, the insurance is forced to cover a very high cost for you. Okay, and that's why insurance agencies will start to increase the premiums for their insurance. But at the same time, this will dissuade other healthy people who do not smoke from buying insurance, which is not good. Okay, this will result in underconsumption of insurance policies. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about is moral hazard. Okay, so how I would explain this is that you take on more risk because other people will be bearing the risk, the cost of the risk you're taking, and not you. Okay, so this will lead to higher social costs. In the insurance market, this happens when you know you're covered by health insurance, so you decide to take on more risky activities because you know that you're covered by health insurance. So now the insurance company will be thinking, so because all these people think that they're covered under health insurance, and then now they're gonna take on more risky activities, I may as well just increase the insurance premiums, because either way these people are not going to, these people know that they're covered by insurance, so I should just make them pay more lah. So this will increase the price of insurance, and fewer people who are actually who do not participate in these moral hazards are now disadvantaged because of the higher cost of insurance policies. Okay. In the medical services, it can happen when the doctor orders additional tests for the patients because of his greediness. Okay, private doctors can tell you, hey, you need even though you don't have any high blood pressure or any high cholesterol or blood glucose, they will just be like, hey, I think you need to go for a HbA1c test to test for your blood glucose, or take a lipid panel when it's not necessary at all. Or let's say you've taken an echocardiogram which can last for 3 years, and then your doctor sees you and says, I think you should go for a treadmill ECG, even though your echocardiogram is still valid and there isn't a need for any further testing. So the doctor will be incentivized to do this because he gains more money that way. And this is what we call producer-induced demand. Yeah. because the costs are borne by the consumers and not the doctor itself when they undergo those testing. Okay, yeah. So next we talk about factor immobility, a very, very small chapter, a very, very small part of market failure. Okay. So when we talk about factor immobility, there are two things: geographical immobility and occupational immobility. Geographical immobility will be for example, the transportation of your factors of production, and also the transportation of human labor. So because of the lag in time for geographical immobility, there's a period of time where all these factors of production are not being fully utilized because they are still traveling on the road towards the factory. So in that case, there will be misallocation of scarce resources during the period of time these things are being transported. So the better your transport structures, the lower your geographical immobility, because the better your transport infrastructures are, the easier your factors of production can move around from point A to point B, and this will improve the efficiency of your production line. Occupational immobility will be more relevant for places with sunset industries. So for example, like Singapore, we used to be very big in production, so we had many factories around, but then gradually as technology caught up and they realized that Singapore couldn't hold so many factories, they decided to close down these factories, and human labor very soon became more and more obsolete. So these people who are these people who have been mechanical laborers their whole life, they are unable to move on to jobs which require a higher level of education or more technical skills. So as such, these people can work, but they're not being utilized at all because of their lack in skills, or they haven't been able to upgrade their skills in the past year. So you have just this group of laborers around that are not being fully utilized, and that's misallocation of resources, which results in allocative inefficiency and hence market failure. Okay, so now you'll be thinking, then how will the market just fail? There has to be some form of intervention, and intervention comes in the form of government intervention. Basically, these are solutions to all the forms of market failures. Okay, so here you have subsidies, taxes, education, licensure, or laws, and nationalization. And each of these forms of government intervention are there to treat different root causes. Okay, so when I put down laws, right, laws is actually just a very broad term of multiple solutions that can be put in place by the government to correct market failure. Okay, laws can also include a total ban. All right, so subsidies, most of the time you use it for positive production externalities such as R&D. Government provides grants to companies to undergo R&D so that they can improve the production processes, improve efficiency, and also improve the state of technology. Very soon in macroecons, you learn that an improvement in state of technology is good because this increases the total capacity of the economy, which is good for your sustainable growth. Taxes, on the other hand, is to be able to force the producers to internalize the externalities produced. Okay, and then education is to correct imperfect information. You teach people about the importance of education, and you teach people about the importance of getting vaccines for their own health and safety, and also for the general safety of the public and society. Next, you have licensure, such as in medical practice, you need to have licenses so that you will be attached to a board, and then in any case of you defrauding patients, the doctor will have to now bear a greater risk. Okay, and this will dissuade doctors from forcefully ordering tests that are not necessary for patients. Okay, nationalization is a way to correct market failure due to public market dominance. I think this one I will leave it to Yicheng to cover a bit more later. All right. Now I think someone asked about evaluations for market failure, and the very simple answer is that not every solution is correct. All right. And then when we consider the evaluation portion of your market failure essay, you look at three things in general. Okay, the feasibility of implementing these solutions and the effectiveness of these solutions, and then you need to think about, are there any unintended consequences? Will the solution cause any other problems? Okay, so now like what I wrote here, taxes. There's a possibility that you can overtax for a certain good. Okay, so let's say if you have too much of tax, if you place too high a carbon tax on petrochemical companies, there's a very high chance that you will overtax them, and then now you have a shortage. There will be underproduction of petrochemicals, so there's a lack of energy production in your country, and that's not good for society. Okay, when you talk about effectiveness, does it address the root cause? So let's say you know there's a market failure due to imperfect information, but your government decides to instead provide subsidies. So, okay, subsidies will definitely help to improve the situation of market failure, but does it treat the root cause? How long more can you provide subsidies? Okay. Feasibility. Feasibility is a concern when your government is running down on its reserves. So let's say Singapore has been giving so many subsidies during COVID. Is it running down on its reserves? All the subsidies for your COVID tests, all the subsidies for your ART kits. Is it feasible to implement another subsidy for another illness? Yeah, that's something that the government will have to consider. Okay. So that will be all for market failure. I will now hand over the time to Yicheng to go through firms and decisions with you.
All right. Okay. So apologies, it might overrun a little bit more, but I think this is quite important for us to cover. Right. So the last part of this entire sharing is actually firms and decisions, or in some other schools you call it market structure, right? So I'm gonna go through some common misconceptions and topics that are actually some of you guys asked, especially during the Q&A session, like the Google form that we sent out, right? All right. Next slide, please. Right, so I'm going to run through some efficiency definitions. This is one of the key aspects that actually a lot of students struggle with, right? So there are three main efficiencies, right? Allocative efficiency, we have productive efficiency, and we have dynamic efficiency. So I'll go through exactly what these efficiencies mean and how we should be approaching them systematically. Now, the first one is allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency is one thing that you see throughout microeconomics, be it in market failure, market structure, firms and decisions, right? You see a lot. But what does it actually mean? Allocative efficiency in layman terms should be defined as the allocation of resources to produce the combination of goods and services most wanted by the society, right? Which means that if a society or an economy is considered allocatively efficient, right, they'll be producing a good and combination of goods and services that is most desired by society. So everybody gets what they want, basically, to the best of their ability, of course, right? And this is achieved when the price of a certain firm, right, is equal to marginal cost. So if I say that this firm is actually allocatively efficient, the price of which they sell their goods at is the same as marginal cost, which most of the time doesn't happen because this is not profit maximizing, right? Next. Allocative inefficiency in this case, right, can be described with this graph. So let me just run you through it real quick, right? So as you can see, this graph you should be most familiar with, right? It's one of the firms and decisions graphs. So right now here I have a graph of what seems like a monopoly or like an oligopoly, right? So in this case, as you can see, at the profit maximizing output of Q1, okay, so where MC equals to MR, that's where most firms would produce at because it's profit maximizing, right? So at this Q1, the price at which they're selling this goods at is P1, whereas the cost at which, right, is actually not labeled here. Is where the vertical line at Q1 actually intersects ATC, which in this case is another word for average cost, average total cost or average cost, right? So as you can see here, right, this is an example of allocative inefficiency because at the profit maximizing output where MR equals to MC, the price of goods is at P1. However, the price is actually larger than MC. So as you can see, P1 is higher than the actual marginal cost where it intersects at C. Okay, so because price is not the same as marginal cost, right? In this case, price is larger and price is not the same as marginal cost. This is not considered as allocatively efficient. Okay, so as long as your price is higher than marginal cost and not coinciding with marginal cost, you don't have an allocative efficient output. Okay, what this means is that consumers actually place a higher value on an additional good than what it costs the firm to produce it. So the more goods are produced, right, actually you have more consumer surplus to reap. But because we are actually restricting the firm is actually restricting the output at the profit maximizing output, they're unable to get their benefit and their utility. So the red color part that we shaded here, right, triangle ABC, or rather not really a triangle, it's more of like a quadrant, right? It actually signifies the deadweight welfare loss due to this inefficiency. Okay, so if they were to produce, at this case, right, if they were to produce at P equals to MC, which is price equals to marginal cost, the firm will actually produce at Q2. Is it Q2? I can't quite see it. It's getting, but I think it's Q, yeah. It will produce at Q, right, instead of Q1. So at Q, right, this is what we call an allocative efficient output, right? Allocative efficient because the price is the same as the marginal cost. You see that the P line, horizontal line, actually coincides with MC, right? What that means is that at this price, right, it's allocatively efficient and we are maximizing what the society wants, okay? So by producing at Q1 instead of Q, we're actually missing out on this red color portion, right? Because you know, you don't get to benefits the extra get to reap the extra benefits of the additional AR that can be obtained from increasing this output. Okay, so this is called a deadweight welfare loss, and you can write it in your essays and basically just demarcate it the way that we showed it here, right? Just label it, write the points ABC, and then say that actually, you know, area ABC is what we call a deadweight welfare loss. Next slide, please. Now, the second type of inefficiency or efficiency is productive efficiency. Now, productive efficiency is defined as the production of goods and services at the lowest possible average cost of production. So what this means is that it's defined, right, as basically when the firm produces at the bottom portion of LRAC, so the minimum point of the LRAC curve, right? So when you produce at that place, right, you are said to have basically achieved the minimum efficient scale or MES, right, and produced at the lowest possible average cost, right? So what this means is that in layman terms, you can think of it like this, right? Productive efficiency means that you are producing at the lowest cost. Basically, the firm is actually reaping all of its internal economies of scale, is actually basically doing the most to reduce its cost and increase its revenue by itself. So this is something that actually firms want to do as well. They want to produce as efficiently as possible so that they can cut down on costs and maximize profits. Okay, right? Next slide. Okay, so productive inefficiency in a monopoly or oligopoly looks something like this, right? So let's talk about long run curves, right? You see that actually instead of writing MC and AC, we're talking about long run MC and long run AC, right? So these are all long run curves and it's all in the long run equilibrium, right? So this curve, right, is this entire graph over here describes a monopoly or an oligopoly. So in monopolies or oligopolies, right, they do not necessarily have productive efficiency from the get-go. All right, they might get it based on luck, but usually they don't, right? And the reason is because of something like this. So as you can see in this graph, right, what happens is that at the profit maximizing output, which is where MC or LRMC coincides with MR. So at QE, right, is where we're talking about. The cost of production is actually at C. The price is at PE. But you realize that this point Y, where this line actually coincides the LRAC, right, where we get the cost of this production, right, is not actually at the minimum point of LRAC. We're not at the minimum. There's still a bit off internal economies of scale to reap, right? So because we're not producing at the most minimum point, we are not considered productively efficient. This is called productive inefficiency because we are not basically minimizing the cost, the long run average cost of production. Okay, so not all internal economies of scale are exhausted, right? And we are currently not at the minimum point of the LRAC. Now, let's take a look at the next slide where there will be an example of productive efficiency. Okay, the slide was labeled wrongly, my apologies. This is actually productive efficiency. So as you can see, comparing this slide to the previous slide, right? In this case, LRAC actually, the curve LRAC actually coincides directly with the point where LRMC and MR coincides. So the cost in this case is actually coinciding with the minimum point of LRAC, right? The minimum point of LRAC. And what this means is that the economy actually, or this monopoly in general, is achieving productive efficiency because they are minimizing the costs required, right? So LRMC and MR coincides with the minimum point of LRAC, and this is how you diagrammatically show that actually this firm is producing efficiently. Okay, so how does this happen, right? You might be asking, how do you know when a monopoly or an oligopoly actually has productive efficiency? And the answer to the question is you don't, because this only happens, right, by chance, right? I cannot guarantee you that because it's a monopoly or an oligopoly, it can definitely be productively efficient. It might be based on chance, but it also might not be, depending on how good they are at estimating where their economies of scale has been exhausted. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that for monopolies and oligopolies, where there are a lot of market power, they have the ability to have productive efficiency, but it doesn't mean that they are necessarily going to be productively efficient. Okay, they can, but it doesn't mean that they must. All right, next slide, please. All right, so in this case, let's talk about another sort of very common market structure, which is monopolistic competition, right? So in this structure itself, we have the inability to actually be productively efficient. So as opposed to monopolies and oligopolies, because monopolistic competition or firms in monopolistic competition actually have only normal profits in the long run, they are unable in the long run to actually achieve productive efficiency. Right, as you can see in this curve, right, because they only can achieve normal profits in the long run, LRAC curve or AR curve, they're actually AR curve, the AR line, right, or average revenue curve, is a tangent to the LRAC. And this is always the case in the long run for monopolistic competition. And that's because they can only earn normal profits in the long run, right? This means that when you are trying to profit maximize at LRMC equals to MR, right, which is at point QE, right, at QE, the profits, right, or the price is the same as the cost, because in the long run, all monopolistic competition, due to low barriers of entry and due to the market structure itself, as you guys know, all monopolistic competition firms, right, or firms with that structure would all have normal profits. Okay, they will all default to normal profits, right? So because of that, they are unable forever, they will never be able, right, in the long run to achieve productive efficiency, because the LRAC curve, the bottom of it would never coincide with the tangent of AR. So as you can see in this curve, right, the QMES portion is where the productive efficiency is actually met. But we are currently producing not at QMES, but at QE instead, right? So this is what we call excess capacity theorem. Excess capacity theorem. So it's another way to describe this phenomenon of productive inefficiency. Okay, so if people ask you, or if the question says, hey, can you explain the excess capacity theorem? This is what we're talking about. Is the inability for monopolistic competition firms to actually achieve productive efficiency in the long run. Next slide, please. So this is a very nice diagram. We'll send you these slides afterwards, right? This is a very nice diagram to actually show you what each of these structures can achieve and what they cannot achieve. The last efficiency is dynamic efficiency, which I think there should be slides for, but I don't know why it's not there. Okay, but essentially just a quick precursor, right? A quick like introduction. This dynamic efficiency is essentially just basically how technologically advanced and how well they're using technology, right? So a dynamically efficient firm, right, they will constantly be investing in research and development, developing their goods, differentiating their goods, producing better ways to improve the quality and quantity of their goods, right? And essentially keeping themselves abreast of all developments. So that's what we call dynamic efficiency. So it has to do with research and development, technology, and things like that, right? So if you look at this diagram, how do you interpret it, right? Red circles represent that this entire structure can never achieve a certain efficiency. Yellow means that it can achieve, but only by chance, and green means that it will always achieve. So for the most common like market structures, which is oligopoly and monopolistic competition, we see that allocative efficiency can never be achieved by these structures, right? Whereas for perfect competition, it can be. Okay, productive efficiency, monopoly and oligopoly, because they have supernormal profits in the long run, they can achieve, but only by chance. Whereas for monopolistic competition, they can never achieve it because of the excess capacity theorem, as previously mentioned. Now, dynamic efficiency is a little bit trickier, right? Monopolies can never achieve it, and this is not because they are unable to. They cannot achieve it because they have no incentive to keep dynamically efficient. Why is that so? Imagine you are maybe like you are Coca-Cola, for instance. You own all of these beverage chains from Fanta to Sprite and stuff like that. And you realize that actually, hey, I am really dominating the market right now, right? I'm the only person in this entire market, right, that can supply good drinks, right? Because of that, would you, as Coca-Cola company, right, would you want to spend extra money, all of your profits, to developing a new drink brand when you know that nobody's going to compete with you? The answer is no, right? Even though you do have that super normal profits, you have a lot of money, you have a lot of funds to actually do this, chances are you would not, because you have no incentive to do so, right? On the other hand, oligopolies, which are basically market structures with with a few dominant firms, right? But oligopolies will always have to achieve dynamic efficiency because they have the incentive to do so because they want to outsmart their opponents and acquire a larger market share, right? And they also have the means to do so because they also reap supernormal profits. All right. So this is just a diagram for you guys, just to make sure that you all actually understand which of these efficiencies are relevant, what time. All right. Next. Okay, now we're going to go through a little bit more about different oligopolistic theories, right? So we have Kinked demand theory here. All right, so the Kinked demand theory it goes like this, right? Oligopolies it's assumed that rival firms, right? So for example, in an oligopoly, right, rival firms will match any price decrease, but they will not match price increases. So for instance, right, let's say I have two different companies. Okay, sorry. Let's use the next slide to explain. I think next slide should have some animations. Right, so I have Coke and Pepsi. All right, I love this analogy. So Coke and Pepsi, they are existing in an oligopoly because they are both very dominant firms in a beverage industry. Okay, so if let's say today Coke increases their price to $10 a can, do you think Pepsi will follow suit? Answer is probably no, right? Because Pepsi will be like, hey, if Coke increases their cans to $10, people would obviously turn to me because I'm a close substitute of Coca-Cola. So that means that for Pepsi, right, they will not increase the price as well because they know that they can actually acquire a much larger market share by keeping their prices low. So they will not match any price increases by Coca-Cola, right? But if let's say Coca-Cola today decreases their prices from $1 a can to 50 cents a can, do you think Pepsi will stay at $1 a can? Chances are they would not, right? Because they will lose out to Coca-Cola when everybody turns to Coca-Cola. All of their consumers be like, hey, Coca-Cola tastes similar, but they actually have a cheaper alternative. So why am I spending $1 on Pepsi when I can spend 50 cents on Coca-Cola instead? So if they keep their prices at the same level and don't decrease together with Coca-Cola, what will happen is that they will lose a lot of consumers. All right. So this is what Kinked demand theory means, right? You have an increase, okay, in when you have like oligopolies not matching increases but matching decreases in essence lah. All right, next slide please. Right, so the next thing is price wars. This is also a competitive theory for oligopolies, right? Price wars. So this is what happens when oligopolies take the previous example to the extreme. Okay, so next slide please. The example of price war is as such, right? So for instance, right, we have Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola once again. Now, Coca-Cola decreases their price from $1 to 50 cents. And Pepsi-Cola says, hey, I don't like this, right? I'm going to now decrease my price to an even smaller amount. I decrease my price from $1 to 20 cents per can. And Coca-Cola is like, okay, I'm not going to let you beat me. So from 50 cents, they decrease their price to 10 cents. And it just keeps going down and down and down until the price becomes super low and it cannot cover marginal cost anymore. So this is what we call a price war, right? When companies, right, or firms, competing firms, they actually compete with each other and undercut each other's prices consecutively, right? When they do things like that, what happens is that they basically, results in like a cascade, a cycle, right, where they keep undercutting each other's prices in order to kick one of the other out of the market. This obviously happens, in the very oligopolistic, very competitive markets, and you see this actually in real life. So I don't know if you guys realize this, but one year or 2 years ago, there used to be this like price war of telecoms, right? So initially, 3 gigs of data will cost you like $30 a month. But now if you look at the plans, right, it's actually like 60 gig for like $20. So it's much cheaper than it was before. And the reason for that is because existent telco companies or telecom companies in Singapore decided to basically start undercutting each other's prices, right? And it resulted in this mini price war between all of these companies, which has resulted in a lot of the different goods becoming extremely cheap and extremely affordable. They keep trying to undercut each other to kick out new entrants. So it's one of those methods of predatory pricing that companies like to use to basically acquire market share and kick competitors out of the market. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so now we have two theories for oligopolies, right, that are actually cooperative in nature. So the previous two, price wars as well as king demand theory, are assuming that oligopolies are actually competitive. They're competing with each other, right? Now we're talking about oligopolies cooperating with each other. So this is what we call collusion, right? Cartel theory is a formal collusive agreement between various firms in an oligopoly to fix the price and output within the oligopoly itself. Right, so what this means is as such. Next slide, please. So same example, Pepsi and Coca-Cola, right? Instead of fighting each other, they actually collaborate, right? They shake hands and they say, hey, let's do this agreement, right? Formally, and say that, okay, so you will raise your prices to $2, I will also raise my prices to $2. And because we are the only companies that can provide like cola beverages, right? Because of that, people would definitely have to turn to us no matter what. So not only will you also have your market share because we are increasing by the same amount of price, you will retain your market share, I will also retain my own market share, but we will both earn more profits because now we're increasing our prices together. So I'm not stealing your market share, you're not stealing mine, but we're both earning a win-win agreement. Now, who loses in this agreement? The consumers, right? So when a cartel is formed, consumers will lose out. Okay, because they have to pay more. There are very few substitutes, they cannot turn to anywhere else. They are forced to basically pay a higher price. So this is what we call a false monopoly, right? When oligopolies come together and they make agreements, formal agreements like such, to change and fix prices, right? What happens is that you actually have an effective monopoly. These oligopolies act together as a singular entity and it becomes a monopoly-like structure. And this is why it's actually it's very damaging to the economy, because when people do that, they reap a lot of supernormal profits and they actually reduce the welfare and utility for the consumers themselves. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the last example is a little bit similar to the cartel theory, but it's actually a collusive agreement that is not as formal as the cartel theory, right? So this is called tacit collusion. So firms, right, instead of saying, hey, let's shake hands on it and let's collude together, sometimes they do this tacit collusion where there's no formal written agreement, but they still do have the same effects as a normal collusion. Right, so what happens is that they will recognize a pricing policy of they'll basically follow a recognized leader in terms of pricing policy, and it's usually the dominant firm with the most market share, right? And so what happens is that they will basically increase prices when this dominant firm increases prices, and the entire oligopoly essentially works as a monopoly. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so same example, right? Pepsi and Coca-Cola, instead of having a formal agreement this time, they will do a very tacit agreement. So this is a silent agreement, right? They don't tell anyone, there's no written agreement, there's no clause. But what happens is, because Coca-Cola is the larger company, when Coke increases their prices, okay, Pepsi-Cola will follow suit because they recognize Coca-Cola as the price leader, and they have this informal, unwritten agreement, right? Usually coordinated behind the scenes, right, to sort of orchestrate this. So this is called price leadership. So this is a little bit harder for authorities to actually find out and actually pinpoint, because there's no formal agreement. You cannot actually say, hey, they did this because they were colluding. It's very hard to prove. Okay, so that's price leadership. So those are 4 different models of oligopolies, right? So let's recap again. 2 competitive ones, we have price wars and king demand theory. 2 cooperative ones, we have tacit collusion, which is price leadership, which is what we just talked about, and cartel theory. Okay, now the last part of today's presentation, right, the very last part, we have I think 5 slides left or so, is price discrimination, right? Next slide. So this is part of a firm's tactics to sort of increase their revenue by basically exploiting the difference in difference in the demand elasticity, price elasticity of demand for various goods. So they will basically charge different prices for the same product, and price discrimination only occurs when you charge different prices to different groups of consumers that are not due to difference in cost. Okay, so what does that mean? Not due to difference in cost. So for instance, right, next slide. There are 4 different types. Okay, so there are 3 different types of conditions for effective price discrimination. So the first one is that the firm must have some sort of monopoly power. What does this mean? They must be able to set prices, right? If let's say I am a firm, right, that don't have monopoly power, right? I'm someone who is in a monopolistic competitive environment and I sell, for example, pens. Do you think that if I set my pen at $2 for this random person, they'll want to buy it? Probably not, because there are so many other substitutes, right? I don't have market power. I don't have monopoly over the pens. So I must be in the industry and I must be in a position where I can provide some sort of monopoly power. Right? So the example of monopoly power, right, is actually what we call like tickets. Right, for example, selling tickets, right, selling of concert tickets, right. That's an example of having some degree of monopoly power, because you own, as someone who owns the concert tickets, right. You actually basically are the only person who can provide admissions to see a certain singer or certain performer. So that's what we call price setting power. Now the second condition is that there must not be any seepage or any leakage, right? Cannot be any resale of goods. It must be prevented. So if there's any resale, right, this doesn't work, because if let's say I want to charge you a higher price than other people, if let's say the other people can find you and sell you their goods, right? Sell you their goods, which I gave them at a cheaper price, then this doesn't work, because nobody want to buy from me. Okay, nobody want to buy from me. Right? Give me a second. Sorry, 1 second. All right. So the last condition for effective price discrimination is actually different price elasticity. So I can only be able to actually charge different prices if different people have different degrees of willingness to buy. If everybody wants the same product the same way, I cannot charge different prices, right? But if somebody wants it more than another person, I can sell this product to another person at a higher price because they are more in need of it. And that way I can actually earn more profits. So for instance, if let's say I'm very, very thirsty, right? And my willingness to purchase a bottle of 100 plus is very, very high, right? And let's say someone else sells 100 plus. Now, if they want to sell this 100 plus to someone who is very not thirsty, right? Let's say I had a lot of water, they will sell it to me for maybe 50 cents and I'll consider because it's cheap. But if I've just finished running 10 kilometers and I need some water, they will sell it to me for higher because I will be willing to pay up to $15 for a quote bottle of 100 plus. So it's really about the degree of willingness to buy. And if they do that, instead of just selling everyone $1, right, they'll earn much more because they're actually playing towards how willing you are to buy and pricing it accordingly. Okay, next slide, please. Now, there are 4 different types of price discrimination. The first one is first degree price discrimination. So this is the most ideal form of price discrimination for a firm. Most ideal because you actually reap the most amount of money from it. Now, this price discrimination means that every producer will sell each individual unit of a commodity separately to a consumer at the maximum price that they are willing to pay. Maximum price, okay? So what that means is that I sell you this item, I'll sell someone else in a different price. I'm not grouping you all together, I'll sell you all individually. Okay, so how does this work in real life? What examples can I give? Next slide, please. So a salient example of this price discrimination is actually this thing called a Dutch auction. Okay, have you guys heard of a Dutch auction? So what a Dutch auction is, right, is a different form of auctioning, right, that is separate from what you normally do. So you know normal auctions, the price starts to go up, right? You go higher and higher and higher. For a Dutch auction, right, the price starts going lower. So what that means is that for Dutch auction, you actually start with a very high price. So for instance, I want to sell flowers, right? These flowers are very, very unique to me. I start at a price of $2,000, and then everybody in an auction, they'll start bidding, right? The price will keep dropping. 2,000. Nobody think, okay, never mind, 1,900. Nobody take 1,800. It keep dropping until the first person basically says, I want it. And it's sold to whoever asks for it first. So instead of bidding upwards, right, we're actually slowly going down and selling to the first bidder. Okay, how this actually works, right, it plays out in real life, it actually plays to the willingness of people to buy it. So you'll be managed to sell this good to the person who wants it the most, and you sell it for the highest price possible. Because nobody will wait until it goes down too low because they fear that the good will be sold to someone else. So it's a good representation of the exact willingness for these people to buy. All right, next slide, please. Now, the second type of price discrimination is second degree price discrimination, and this is also known as block pricing. So what is block pricing? Block pricing is achieved by creating a schedule of declining prices for different quantities, right? So what this means is this, right? Bulk order. Have you heard of bulk order, right? So if let's say I buy 1,000 bottles of Coke from someone, okay, they will charge me at a lower price than if I buy 1 Coke because I'm buying a lot of goods at once, right? From this one person, so they actually get more sales. So in a similar vein, in actual economics, you realize that there are a lot of instances of this bulk buying occurring. So if I have if I have a big order, right, obviously it will cost lower per unit, right? Because as a producer, I want to sell more and I'll incentivize my buyers to buy more from me. Okay, so it's all about profit maximization, right? the second last type of price discrimination is third degree price discrimination. And this occurs when producers charge different prices for the same commodity in different sub-markets. So different segments of the main market, right? So instead of first degree price discrimination, which is when you essentially charge individual different prices, now I'm separating the entire market into various sub-markets, right? So different smaller portions of this market based on different like groups of consumers. Okay, next slide. Okay, so for instance, right, electricity or clothes, right? Electricity. If I have electricity sold to an industrial customer, right? Let's say I'm a factory owner and I'm buying electricity from a power plant. I'll be sold the electricity at a cheaper price, right? Because I'm buying it in a large amount and I'm having a large contract that allows me to sort of get electricity for a consistent period of time. Whereas for a consumer, a basic household consumer like myself, if let's say I am buying electricity from a power plant, I'll be paying a much higher premium because there's no guarantee in terms of the contract or guarantee in terms of how much money I'm actually paying this power plant. Next slide, please. All right, the last form of price discrimination is peak load pricing. So this is a little bit contentious because sometimes it's not considered as price discrimination. I'll explain why that is in a bit. But first off, what is peak load pricing? Peak load pricing is the phenomenon of producers charging more for goods and services during peak periods than during off-peak periods. So I don't know if you guys have noticed this, right? But if you go to like a tourist attraction, for instance, like zoo, or you go to like even food restaurants sometimes, right? You realize that they have different prices for different types of the day or different dates, right? So weekdays normally cost much cheaper than weekends, and public holidays are the most expensive, right? Same thing for food restaurants. Have you been to like buffet restaurants or sukiya, for instance, right? You realize that dinner times and public holidays are always much more expensive than when you come during like a weekday, for instance, or weekday lunch or weekday breakfast, right? So this is what we call peak load pricing. And this is a way to sort of like increase and maximize the amount of money you're earning based on the amount of people that you're expecting. Now, this is not always a form of price discrimination. It must fulfill the last criteria for it to be a price discrimination, which means what? Which means this, right? If let's say the pricing difference is due to cost differences, right? Then it is not considered a price discrimination. So what does this mean? Let's say, for instance, the restaurant, right? The reason why they charge so much more during peak periods is because the cost of maintenance, right? Because of these people increases. So it's actually a cost difference. Then this is not considered price discrimination. This is just another form of different price strategies. Okay, so just remember the conditions of price discrimination when you're answering questions, all right? Okay, so that's basically it. I've come to the end of my sharing, Zach as well, and we will be accepting questions. Okay, we have one question. Why does the AC curve cut at the minimum with MC curve? Here's the idea of it, right? So we have a cost curve over here, right? AC, MC, and ABC are respectively average cost, marginal cost, and average variable cost, right? So the reason why MC curve always actually coincides with the minimum of AC curve, right, is that MC curve is marginal cost, which means it is the average, is the cost of the next unit being produced, right? So at the output level, right, what's the cost of the next unit being produced? That's the marginal cost. Average cost is the total cost, all MCs, so basically you can consider all of these. I don't know if you can see my mouse. All of these at each individual output added together, divided by the total output is your average cost. So as you can see, right, because the marginal cost actually decreases at the start, right, and it's lower than AC, so the curve actually goes out like that. So initially, MC coincides with AC. Let me show you a better curve. I think there should be a better representation of this. Usually it's always drawn like that, but if you were to extend and extrapolate this, right, MC will actually coincide with AC 2 times. The first time is at the top, right, where it first comes out. So the first at 0, right, when it's 0, right, MC and AC will be together, they'll coincide. Because when the unit is 1, so when the number of units is 1, average cost is the same as marginal cost, right? Because the next unit costs the same as the average units. But as it goes down, marginal cost actually becomes cheaper than average cost. And average cost takes time to catch up, right? But as marginal cost increases after a certain point, right, after you have reaped all of your internal economies of scale, and it continues going up, right, and increasing, it will reach a point where it will coincide with AC curve once again, which is this break-even point. And it coincides at the minimum point of AC because the moment MC crosses AC, AC will start to change from decreasing to increasing. Does it make sense? So it's all about the definition of marginal cost as well as average cost, right? Average cost is every marginal cost added together to form total cost divided by the quantity, or the total quantity produced. All right. So once MC passes AC and surpasses it going upwards, right? The next unit will cost more than the previous unit and cause the average cost to start increasing. And that's why the minimum of AC curve is actually where MC coincides with it. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Thank you so much for joining us.